Imagine this. You're in a treehouse tucked away from the world, enjoying the serenity of nature. Suddenly you hear strange noises, whispers in the wind, or even something lurking in the shadows. Something doesn't feel right, and before you know it, your peaceful escape turns into a nightmare. This video will leave you questioning the safety of your own childhood hideaway. Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we'll uncover 3 disturbing true treehouse horror stories that will make you think twice about your next outdoor adventure. So grab a seat, hold tight, and let's jump into these terrifying tales. Story 1, the creepy neighbor Laura Parker. When Laura Parker and her family moved into their new home in the small, quiet town of Briarwood, they were excited to settle in and enjoy the peaceful surroundings. The house was a charming 2-story with an expansive backyard, perfect for her children, Emma and Jake, to play and explore. Among the large oak trees at the back of the property was a towering, weathered treehouse. It had clearly been there for years, and despite its age, it seemed like the perfect spot for the kids to make their own little sanctuary. The first few weeks were blissful. The family spent their evenings barbecuing in the backyard while the children played in the treehouse. However, over time, Laura began to notice strange things happening. It started small, just a feeling of unease that would settle in when she was in the kitchen, watching her children play. She would often glance out the window, noticing how the wind seemed to whisper through the trees. But it wasn't the wind. There was something about the way the branches moved that unsettled her, as if someone or something was watching. One evening after dinner, Laura was cleaning up in the kitchen when she heard Jake call out from the backyard. She rushed outside thinking he was hurt, but instead she found him looking up at the treehouse with wide, frightened eyes. "Mom, there's someone in the treehouse," Jake said, his voice shaky. Laura brushed it off as an overactive imagination and followed Jake outside. She looked up at the treehouse but saw no one. "It's just your imagination, sweetheart," she reassured him. "Maybe you saw a bird or a squirrel." Alarmed, Laura decided to inspect the treehouse herself. As she climbed the wooden ladder, she felt the hairs on her arms rise. The inside of the treehouse was just as she remembered it, empty except for some old toys and a few blankets. But something was wrong. It felt cold. The air was damp, almost as though it had been disturbed. And there in the corner of the treehouse was something that made Laura's blood run cold. A small, folded piece of paper. Her heart raced as she unfolded it. The note was simple, written in a hasty, scrawled handwriting. "I'm always watching." Feeling uneasy, she decided to speak to her neighbors, hoping they might know more about the history of the property. The neighbor across the street, Mrs. Williamson, was an elderly woman who had lived in Briarwood for decades. When Laura asked about the treehouse, Mrs. Williamson's face grew pale. "That treehouse," she muttered, "has always been strange. There were rumors about it, you know. People said there was something sinister about that place. The last family who lived here had to leave in a hurry, but no one ever talked about why. Just don't go up there." Then one evening, after returning from the store, Laura found something chilling. Jake came running inside, his face ashen. "Mom, there's a man outside," he gasped. Laura rushed to the window. She saw no one, but her eyes were drawn to the treehouse, and there, standing motionless at the base of the tree, was a man in a dark coat staring up at the house. His face was obscured by shadows, but there was something about his stillness that made Laura's skin crawl. She called the police, but by the time they arrived, the man had vanished. The search yielded no sign of anyone. The treehouse was quiet, empty. The next morning, Laura found the note again, hidden in the branches. It was the same as the first one. "I'm always watching." Terrified, Laura made the decision to leave Briarwood. The treehouse, and whatever dark presence lingered there, had haunted her family long enough. They packed up and moved to a new home, but the memories of the strange man and the eerie note never left her. Story 2, The Laughter in the Dark. Marcus Hayes. Marcus Hayes had always loved the outdoors, so when his childhood friend Dylan invited him to stay at his family's cabin in the woods, he jumped at the chance. The highlight of the property was an old treehouse built decades ago by Dylan's grandfather. Perched high in a towering pine tree, it overlooked the lake and was large enough for the two friends to camp out in for the weekend. On their first night, the two men sat around the fire pit, reminiscing about their school days. The night air was crisp, and the dense forest was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. As the hours passed, Dylan suggested they sleep in the treehouse for old time's sake. Marcus hesitated. It looked far more weathered than he remembered, but Dylan reassured him it was still sturdy. Climbing up, they found the interior surprisingly intact, though the wood creaked with every step. They laid out their sleeping bags and settled in. As the forest quieted, Marcus began to notice an odd sound. Soft laughter, faint and distant, as if coming from deep within the woods. He nudged Dylan, but his friend was already asleep, snoring softly. Marcus brushed it off, assuming it was the wind carrying voices from the nearby lake. Around 2 a.m., Marcus woke up with a start. The laughter was back, only this time it was much closer. It echoed around the treehouse, as though someone or something was circling it. Peering out of the small window, Marcus scanned the forest below, but all he could see were shadows shifting in the moonlight. He shook Dylan awake, whispering about the strange noises. Dylan dismissed it as Marcus being paranoid and went back to sleep. But Marcus couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. The laughter grew louder, now accompanied by the sound of twigs snapping and leaves rustling beneath the tree. Then, something new happened. Soft tapping, almost rhythmic, began against the treehouse walls. It was slow at first, but then grew louder, as if fingers or claws were scratching at the wooden boards. Marcus grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the door, but the light only illuminated the dark, empty interior. He whispered to Dylan, urging him to listen, and this time Dylan heard it too. The color drained from his face. The tapping grew louder, joined by faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Marcus strained to make out the words but couldn't. His flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the small room. Then, without warning, the treehouse itself shook as if something heavy had slammed against it from below. The whispers grew clearer, though still unintelligible, as if a chorus of voices were speaking in an otherworldly language. Dylan swore he heard his name in the murmurs, causing his breath to hitch. Marcus pressed himself against the farthest corner, clutching his flashlight like a lifeline. They both froze as a low creak echoed from the hatch leading to the ladder, as though someone was testing its weight from below. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the movement stopped. The ladder hung still, and the forest fell silent. The laughter ceased, replaced by an oppressive, eerie quiet. They waited, holding their breath, until the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the trees. When they climbed down, they found the forest floor disturbed. The ladder had been ripped from its anchor and lay sprawled on the ground. What was most chilling, however, were the footprints. Dozens of them circling the base of the tree, small and barefoot, as though children had been playing there in the dead of night. The two men packed their belongings and left the cabin that morning, never looking back. Marcus later learned from Dylan that his grandfather had stopped using the treehouse decades ago after a group of local children disappeared while playing near the lake. Their laughter, it was said, could still be heard in the forest on quiet nights. Story 3, The Watcher in the Trees by Claire Mallory. Claire Mallory had always cherished the treehouse her grandfather built in their family's backyard. Nestled high in a sprawling oak tree, it had been her sanctuary growing up. Even as an adult, she found comfort in retreating there with a good book and a cup of tea. However, one autumn evening, the treehouse became the setting of a nightmare she would never forget. It began when Claire decided to spend the night there to clear her mind after a rough week at work. She brought along a blanket, a flashlight, and a thermos of coffee. The air was cool and crisp, and the rustling leaves above provided a soothing backdrop. But as the night wore on, the peace she sought turned into something far more sinister. Around midnight, Claire was startled by a faint tapping sound against the treehouse walls. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate, as if someone or something was testing the structure. Shining her flashlight out the small window, she expected to see a bird or perhaps a branch swaying in the wind. Instead, the beam of light caught a shadow at the base of the tree. It was tall and motionless, standing just beyond the reach of her flashlight. Her breath hitched as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The figure didn't move, but she could feel its gaze fixed on her. "Hello," she called out hesitantly, her voice trembling. The shadow didn't respond, but the tapping stopped. For several minutes, the forest fell silent, the only sound being the rapid beating of her heart. Just as she began to convince herself it was her imagination, a low guttural laugh broke the silence, sending a chill down her spine. Claire scrambled to lock the small hatch leading into the treehouse. The laughter grew louder, this time joined by the crunch of leaves and snapping of twigs, as if the figure was circling the tree. Peering out the window again, she saw nothing but darkness. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Then came the sound of scratching, long, deliberate strokes against the tree bark. It started at the base of the tree and worked its way up, closer and closer to the treehouse. Claire clutched her flashlight and pressed herself into a corner, praying it was some kind of animal. The scratching stopped abruptly, followed by a deafening silence. Just as she dared to exhale, a heavy thud resonated on the roof. She stifled a scream, her eyes darting upward. Whatever it was had climbed onto the roof of the treehouse. The wood above creaked under its weight, and for a moment Claire thought the entire structure might collapse. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered a silent prayer, willing the nightmare to end. Suddenly she heard a voice, low and distorted, murmuring her name. "Claire!" It hissed, drawing the word out like a taunt. Her blood ran cold. She hadn't told anyone she'd be out there that night. How could anyone know her name? She tried to steady her breathing, but the fear was suffocating. In the midst of her terror, Claire noticed something peculiar. The air inside the treehouse had grown frigid, and her breath came out in visible puffs. Then the flashlight flickered and went out completely, plunging her into darkness. She fumbled for her phone, hoping to use its light, but it refused to turn on. It was as if the presence had drained every ounce of energy from her surroundings. The scratching began again, this time directly beneath her feet, accompanied by a sinister whisper. "Let me in." In a desperate bid for safety, Claire flung open the window and aimed her flashlight toward the roof. The light illuminated a pale, humanoid figure, crouched on the edge, its face twisted into an unnatural grin. Its hollow eyes locked onto hers, and it let out a bone-chilling screech before leaping into the darkness below. Claire didn't sleep that night. She remained in the treehouse until dawn, too terrified to climb down. When morning came, she mustered the courage to descend. To her horror, the bark of the tree was covered in deep scratches, and the ground beneath was littered with long, claw-like marks. But what haunted her most was the message etched into the treehouse wall. "I'll be back." She sold the house shortly after, unable to shake the feeling that the thing in the trees was still watching. To this day, Claire refuses to go near any treehouse, afraid of what she might find lurking in the shadows. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more creepy stories. Which of these stories gave you a chilling experience? Let us know. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that are real.